Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, and this is the symposium for Friday, April 5th, 2024, although we are pre-recording it on April 4th. I will be joined by Paul Gallagher on the editorial board of Executive Intelligence Review, Lyndon LaRouche's flagship publication, who also is going to be sharing with us something about Ireland and Palestine, and will give everyone some insights as to why the Oasis plan is necessary and why it can work. Now, just to open up, we are in the most unbelievable, gut-wrenching situation with a number of events this week that make one wonder if there's any justice to be had. Who is going to enforce it and who determines the rules? We've heard Biden talk about the rules-based order all the time, but then Kirby turns around and says, well, the UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire, which the US finally did not veto but merely abstained, is non-binding. It's non-binding even though the International Court of Justice has found it credible that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and has ordered certain actions to be taken which have been ignored. We had then Israel's strike of the Iranian consulate. This is Iranian territory in Damascus, killing 12, including, I believe, 4 top Iranian military figures. This is a complete violation of international law and various conventions. And then, as if that were not enough, a convoy of food aid, which was delivering 100 tons of food to starving people in Gaza, was bombed by the IDF in such a way as it looks quite willful and deliberate, with each of 3 cars carrying the aid volunteers from Canada, the US, Australia, 1 Palestinian, I believe, so that 7 people were killed. And I was reading today that the parents of one of the American Canadian dual citizen young man, new father, are quite frustrated. They are not getting the answers that they're seeking from either the Canadian or the US government, merely the confirmation from Jerusalem that their son indeed is dead. So it seems to be no bottom to the insanity and arrogance of these people, not to mention their deluded belief that you can keep provoking Russia, namely also China, and that there will be no response. And I say that in Southwest Asia because Iran and Russia are close partners, as are Iran and China. And then we have the situation in Ukraine, where it's being reported now by multiple sources. There are many towns and villages where there are no young men left. They've all been killed or injured. Yet we have lunatics like Senator Chuck Schumer saying that we have to send Ukraine weapons so they can win the war. And if we don't, Russia will be invading the rest of Europe, which is clearly absurd. Russia had 2 years to take over all of Ukraine. It did not. It didn't even take Kiev. All that may change now because with the French discussion of sending ground troops to Ukraine, the Russians have announced that they no longer are running a special military operation, but that they now consider themselves in a state of war. And that's already beginning to affect the situation on the ground in Ukraine differently. So, in such a situation, how does one get peace? How does one even think about peace? And it's in this context that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has revived her late husband, Lyndon LaRouche's Oasis plan, the plan based on the concept that water, not oil, but water, is the most precious resource between Israel and Palestine, and that if you're going to have a peace agreement, part of it will come from the fact that urgently needed, abundant, clean, fresh water for drinking, irrigation, and industrial use is available to everyone. And many people have met this proposal with some with interest, some with optimism. Many say it's impossible, it'll never work, people won't stop fighting. I think it's the only way they will stop fighting. So, as my viewers may be aware, particularly because of the starvation question, which was discussed on a previous symposium with Chris Fogarty, who wrote a book about the British attempt to commit genocide in Ireland by taking all the food away, known erroneously as the potato famine. There is a very close affinity between the Irish and the Palestinian people. Ireland has joined, I believe, the South African case at the International Court of Justice, as now has Colombia. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Gallagher, who can tell us something about why Ireland and Palestine would be so close, and also the parallels for development, why it could work, what are the precedents for this. So, Paul, go right ahead and welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, there is many people are aware, most people are aware really, that in the history of Ireland in the 19th century, there was a famine so terrible that it rivals the immediate impact that the war in Gaza is now having on the population there, and had a far, far longer lasting impact over the next 75 years in the progressive depopulation of the island of Ireland. And they know that this was a colonial, they knew at the time, they know now, this is a colonial policy of effective extermination, attempted extermination of their population, or certainly getting rid of, eliminating it insofar as possible. And they see what's happening now in Gaza, and they have that history and have become not only one of the most pro-Palestine populations in the world, but this is definitely infecting the Americans of Irish descent as well. And they have been putting pressure on elected representatives, and including on the Irish leadership delegation, the Taoiseach and the two prime ministers who came over for St. Patrick's Day, and two of the three of them wound up not going to the White House. So now we've seen in the last few days many Muslims invited to a dinner to end Ramadan at the White House, either not going or going and not eating, and instead going and choosing to confront and argue. And we saw that also with the Irish representatives around St. Patrick's Day, and we're still seeing it. So that affinity is important, obviously, and including at the International Court of Justice now. What's much less known, I mean, in Southwest Asia, Helga Teplerouche is continuously making clear there must be an economic development perspective, one which you indicated concentrates on the provision of fresh water in a desert environment, on the provision of power, on the provision of work, well-paid work, and housing, rebuilding of housing, something which economically makes it possible to end this conflict better than it was at the beginning, living better than it was at the beginning. That is what people who say this can't possibly happen while all this fighting is going on, we have to, that's really pessimism talking. It's really the pain of watching what's going on and thinking, well, the most we could possibly hope for is that this would somehow stop. And beyond that, anything that is raised in terms of a development plan for the entire region is dreaming, but that's pessimism talking. Uh, in Southwest Asia, much more than in Ireland 100 years ago, a development perspective is important to all of the countries in the region. But it certainly was crucial to Ireland in the 1920s to end what was effectively an ongoing population holocaust and to reverse it. And it was done by not the Oasis plan, but an economic and infrastructural development plan, which was extraordinary with the speed with which it was carried out. It was called the Shannon scheme. Back in the time before World War II, major infrastructure projects were called schemes in many places. Australia has the Snowy Mountain scheme. Ireland has the Shannon River scheme. Simply another word for plan. But this one was conceived of by a parliament which was outlawed at the time that it began the commission, which came to plan this Shannon scheme. In 1920, when that commission was formed, the Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, was an outlaw body, but it was planning for the development of the country which it was fighting to gain independence for. And beginning 1923, in the midst of what by then was 5 years of nonstop internecine and anti-colonial fighting, 2 years of a all-out anti-colonial war to force the British to recognize the independence of Ireland or a part of it, and then 2.5, almost 3 more years of civil war in which militias of various militias, either allied with keeping the British power in Ireland or nationalist militias on the other side, those militias fought each other in the Irish Civil War. And even while this was going on, and it was brutal and it was bloody fighting, while it was going on, that Parliament and its commission were moving forward with what eventually became, in 1923, the Shannon River hydroelectric scheme, which was an absolutely extraordinary infrastructural accomplishment, engineering accomplishment, recognized by engineering associations in their historical studies as a milestone project of the world, a project which was a model for similar water projects, water management and hydroelectric projects all over the world, and was, at the time it was completed in 1929, a first, the most efficient hydroelectric project in the world, the project with the highest head, the largest drop of water in through the what they call the inlet tubes into the turbine building, the largest drop, therefore the most efficient generation of electrical power. It was a marvel for its time. It was the first hydroelectric scheme, the first electricity plan of any kind that accomplished, in one 3.5 year period, accomplished the national electrification of a country. That had never happened anywhere in the world before. And that was done literally in the immediate aftermath, and even while the Civil War in Ireland was still going on. So it has had an extraordinary impact since then. I want to show something first, if I can make this share screen work, to give an idea of just how disastrous the loss of the Irish population to famine, disease, unemployment, and emigration was, and how long it had gone on when this initiative and this recovery finally was launched. Here is a peek The exact number here is really less important, this 8 million figure. Some of these charts will include all of the counties of Ireland, including the ones that were in the northern province of Ulster and remained in the British Empire. And some of them will only count the 26 counties which were part of the Irish Free State. So you'll get either 8 million plus or 6 million plus at the time when the plunge began. But this is unmistakable. This is a 75-year period of continuous draining and dying of the population of Ireland until right here in the 1920s, the drop was stopped and slowly began to be reversed. This chart only goes to 2000. If we had gone to the present day, we'd be more back up in the range of approximately 7 million or so, and only recovering the population of 180 years ago. But this is absolutely dramatic in that this was a country which, by a combination of war, famine, pestilence, lack of food, starvation, and mass emigration, a country which was ceasing to exist, which had lost more than half its population continuously over this whole period of time. And this was reversed. Now, that turning point was accomplished at the same time and with the great development project, the Shannon River Scheme, as I indicated, one of the world's leading engineering achievements at that time, and a very worthy predecessor to the United States engineering wonder, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was in part based on taking the Shannon scheme as a model. I'll get to that. To quickly to indicate how bad the situation was, what was called the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916, April of 1916. This was an event which radicalized the Irish population 5 years before they achieved independence. It introduced almost a decade of violent warfare between Irish nationalists and British colonialists, and even civil war among the Irish themselves. But one thing that's important about the Easter Rising is that it was almost universally blamed on an Irish organization which was built on nonviolent civil disobedience, which was built on boycotting British products, and which was built on trying to build an independent industrialization of Ireland, even while fighting for independence. In other words, it was an organization which, from the beginning, completely merged the ideas of developing Ireland's economy, its own industrial capabilities, and at the same time seeking its independence and seeking to end British colonial warfare upon it. And that organization was Sinn Féin, which even means in Gaelic, we ourselves, and which was founded in 1904 on the basis of the works of Friedrich List. Explicitly, those works were the subject of its founding conference in 1904 and continued to be. Friedrich List, of course, was the American system economist, then in Germany, but subsequently returned to the United States. He was a devotee, you would say, a disciple, a later disciple of Alexander Hamilton, and spread Hamilton's idea of national economy to many places around the world, especially in Europe. And although he had lived almost a century before, up to about a half century before, the Sinn Féin took his work as their basis. Now, this, I think, accounts for the fact that the British regarded Sinn Féin as with the greatest concern, as the greatest danger to them. So that even though the Sinn Féin leadership was in no way participating in the Easter Rising. In fact, they didn't even know that it was planned. And to the extent any of them figured out that it was coming, they opposed it publicly. Nonetheless, the British called it the Sinn Féin Revolution. Um, and I could quote this one British commander who was involved in putting it down in April 2016. I'm sorry, 1916. One General Maxwell. He said he intended to arrest all dangerous Sinn Féiners, including those who have taken an active part in the Sinn Féin movement, although not in the present rebellion. So, in other words, it didn't matter if they had anything to do with what was going on. He was going to arrest them all and arrest in this rebellion, as the 16 immediate executions demonstrated. Arrest in this rebellion meant execution. Even in the case of one more or less world famous devotee of Ireland and Sinn Féin, who was actually a British consular official, Roger Casement. He was Sir Roger Casement. He was a British Foreign Service senior official, and yet he was executed very quickly after this, despite prominent people of the type of George Bernard Shaw and various literary figures and so forth trying to organize a clemency movement for him. They all were executed. And that's what the British meant by arresting all the dangerous Sinn Féiners. So this was that rising nonetheless led to the formation of a broader political movement under the banner of Sinn Féin, in fact, and that was formalized in October of 1917. And then they had general elections because in Ireland they voted for members of the parliament in Britain, in Westminster, and 73 seats out of the 105 seats allotted to Ireland were won by members of Sinn Féin in that 1918 election. So, in part because of what the British did, Sinn Féin was in fact made the leadership. They had this perspective. This led to a declaration of independence and the formation under the leadership of Sinn Féin, the formation of what was called the Dáil Éireann, or the Parliament of the Irish Free State, which was not yet the Free State. It had not yet won independence. But immediately then, in 1920, that Parliament formed a commission to examine the resources and the potential use of the resources of Ireland, including industrial uses, and that led to what eventually became the Shannon scheme. So it's interesting to note that I'm going to read you something from the Chronicle, Engineering and Technology History. It calls the Shannon scheme a major electrical engineering world reference site. It says the success of the work on the scheme earned for the participating German firms a worldwide eminence. The scheme, with its head of that means the height from the water level behind the dam down to the water level after it goes through the generation building where the turbines are. That head of some 30 meters was the highest in the world of any hydroelectric project up to that time. It served as an important reference point for Siemens, the German company. Siemens Schuckert was the division which built this, and it established the Irish Electricity Supply Boards and other steps taken in the Free State to encourage the nationalized supply of electricity. It had from the very beginning, when it was just a plan by a Siemens engineer of Irish descent named Dr. Thomas McLaughlin, it had from the beginning attracted worldwide attention. And interestingly, in October 1929, when that hydroelectric project had been finished and was opening, um, just a few days before the first commercial power came out of it, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was then governor of New York, sent a letter to Dublin to the public relations officer of the Electricity Supply Board, whose name was Lawler, requesting details of the Shannon scheme and the formation of the Electricity Supply Board. He wrote that is Roosevelt wrote that he was very interested in the magnificent Shannon scheme and asked for a copy of the Electricity Supply Act 1927, as well as the official minutes of the debates in the Irish Parliament about it. He was following with the greatest interest, he said, the further development of the Shannon scheme, and he wanted to receive all further reports relevant to it. So then later, when Roosevelt was president, they go on, he consulted this information for the Tennessee Valley Project, which he initiated. And of course, the story of that marvel is well known. It effectively took the place of the Shannon scheme as the model for such things internationally. But of course, it was a much more ambitious, almost 10 years later, a much more ambitious and marvelously executed hydroelectric and navigation system than the Shannon scheme itself was. The actual planning of this and building it took place from 1925 to 1929. Along with that was built a grid, an electricity grid, which was national. It made Ireland the first nation with a single national integrated electricity grid, delivering electricity across the entire country. The river's about 225 miles in length, and it's the longest river with the highest flow rate in the British Isles. It drains about a fifth of all of the territory of Ireland. And the generating station is at a town called Ardnacusha in County Clare in southwest Ireland. And I'll show some pictures here in terms of where has share screen gone. There it is. This is gives you an idea of what was engineered. What you see behind the head of the dam there is not the river, but the what's called the head race. That is, it's a canal, and you notice that it's an elevated canal. Embankments have been built up on either side of it. Bridges have been built for roads to cross it. And that elevated embankment runs, I'll show a map in a little bit, runs entirely away from and aside from the Shannon River itself, 4 miles. And in fact, 2 other rivers had part of their flow diverted into this channel as well, in order to enable it, and you can see by the elevation, that it is above the surrounding land, and it is gradually, the elevation is gradually getting greater over this prospect down here of the base of the drop. So here's the head, here's the base. The drop was just under 30 meters. As I mentioned, the highest in the world, with 4 pen tubes, they're called, which come down and pour water from that very high head right through the turbines, and the electricity is generated there. So they had to build quite a lot in order to get to this point where that drop was so large, nearly 100 feet. And the embankment was only one part of it. Let me see if I can get back up here. And you get an idea that in addition to here you can see, looking from the other direction, the head race, and again, this is not the river, the tail race down here, which is bringing the water back to the Shannon River over here and going towards its estuary where it flows into the Atlantic. And you can also see the drop, the turbine building, but you also see here that the connections to transformers to increase the voltage of the electric power and allow it to be generated over distance, and then the electric high voltage lines running away. This was the act which was passed literally as the fighting ended, literally, virtually on the day that it ended. The act which was passed said this would be built in 3.5 years, which it was, and it also specified that a national grid would be built, which would electrify the country. So this was an extraordinary project done very quickly and under a board, the Electricity Supply Board, which was headed by its director, again, Dr. Thomas McLaughlin, the same one who had come up with the concept. And just quoting from the archives of the Electricity Supply Board themselves, they said the scale and importance of the Shannon scheme made it an economic centerpiece for the development of the modern Irish state. It laid the groundwork for rural electrification in the late 1940s, which transformed rural life and improved the quality of life in communities throughout the country, paved the way for economic, social, and cultural change. A quote from another organization, the International Civil Engineering Association, or ICE, the Shannon scheme sped up the country's industrialization and commercial development and is credited with reducing emigration due to greater employment. So rural electrification, stopping allowing the development of industry, stopping the mass immigration, which had been going on, some mass emigration, I'm sorry, out of Ireland, mainly to the United States, which had been going on for the previous 75 years. And it goes on to say, the scheme promoted, that is the archives of the Electricity Supply Board, go on to say, the scheme promoted stability within Ireland following the War of Independence and the Civil War. War of Independence 1919 to 21, Civil War 1922 through 1923. It goes on, politicians in the Irish Parliament rightly referred to the nation-building aspect of the Shannon scheme, and there is no doubt that the measures being taken to implement this great technical project captured fully the spirit of the emerging nations. The detractors, and it talks about how they initially called it McGilligan's White Elephant. McGilligan was the industry minister of the Irish Free State, the first one. They were subsequently proven wrong when electricity consumption began to rise at a phenomenal rate as the Shannon power became available. And this is interesting to me. The Financial Times, writing in December 1928, so the Shannon scheme had not yet started generating, said, the untried administrators of the Free State flung themselves on the Shannon scheme, never forgetting the practical benefits they hoped to realize from it. The president, that is Eamon de Valera, they don't name him, and his colleagues are the shrewdest of psychologists. They have had thrown on their shoulders the not easy task of breaking what in reality is an enormous inferiority complex. And the Shannon scheme is one and probably the most vital of their methods of doing it. The faith of the Free State in the nationwide hydroelectric venture is as steadfast as a religious belief.
Wow. I just want to say, this reminds me a little bit of the spirit in Egypt when they doubled the width of the Suez Canal,
Exactly, yes.
where
This,
everybody is involved somehow.
again, I mean, there's so many interesting aspects of this, including that the builder was Siemens Schuckert, of course, a leading German engineering firm. Germany had recognized the independence of the Irish Free State long before it existed, back in 1914. Germany, of course, had various motives for doing that, and Germany was attempting at least to provide arms to the Easter Rising. In fact, this very famous fellow, Roger Casement, was the conveyor of those arms. He brought them in a ship. He landed too early. He was arrested. The arms were seized. And as I said, he was quickly tried and executed. But Germany, Siemens was gaining an international reputation in part through this very project, through that division. And they and the Irish government in parallel, they were building not only the generating building, the Ardnacrusha Dam and hydroelectric project itself. The Irish government, for the most part, was building the head race, that almost 9 mile long diversion of several rivers into the head right here. The two of them were collaborating in building very quickly about 100 miles worth of railroads in various parts of the country, which were built in order to convey material and machinery to the parts of the scheme. So this was like any big project will do. Transportation will be developed on a modern basis in order to get people and equipment and machinery to that project. And
Do you have a map of
yes,
this river that I think that would help?
you'll see that the river is quite long. It's 225 miles long in a small country. It's by far the largest, and runs more or less from north, flows from north to south, and then straight west out into the Atlantic. The head race diverges from it by as much as 3 miles before reaching the Ardnacrusha plant. In other words, it's 3 miles to the west of the river itself. The river then comes back to the south of it, and the tail race from the hydroelectric plant conveys the water back into the river just as it's entering its estuary and heading out into the Atlantic. Okay, so 250,000 Irish citizens toured the works while they were being constructed in that 3 year period. That's 10%, roughly 10% of the population. As as the film referred to, pessimism had been deep in Ireland after the unsuccessful Easter Rising, the executions, the British forces pouring in once again into the island, the 2 years of war with the British, nearly 3 years of war with the of civil war. Pessimism was deep, and this really turned it around, as Helga said, gave hope very clearly, and then gave results in terms of a better life. So, and in terms of less emigration and more people being able to enjoy that better life. So it was about a 90, I didn't mention it for those who are interested, it generated about 90 megawatts or had a capacity of about 90 megawatts of power, and gave the Irish at that from initially something like 200 kilowatt hours per capita per year of electricity, a very small amount by modern standards. And yet we find that in numerous countries of of Africa, this is still the approximation. So that I think it was essential to stabilize that plus some other smaller works were essential to stabilize the period when there was really a two-state solution in Ireland, the Irish Free State which conducted this work, and the province of Ulster, which remained within the British Empire in the northeastern 6 counties. And those two states' relationship was very uneasy, to put it very mildly. And it was only they got through it through this kind of development, and it was only with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, 70 years later, that the two-state solution became formal, where the two states recognized each other, and actually now the way is open. There's disagreement as to how soon that will be, but the way is open to a unity vote, another unity referendum, and a unified Ireland. We can hope for that. So economic development is the essential path to peace.
Thanks. This brought to mind also the Lincoln's policy of building the Transcontinental Railroad, even while the so-called Civil War was going on. What are your thoughts about the applications of this approach to what's happening in the Middle East right now?
Well, it's just very striking. I mean, I had more or less heard of this plan before, but actually it was only a little while ago that I did much more research on it in order to get an idea of whether it actually changed things in what was then a very bad, a very demoralized situation, which was typified by, among other things, by the popular expression, "If there's a government in Ireland, I'm against it," which characterized one wing of the IRA for a long time. And the pessimism that went with that. Clearly, right now, the slaughter that's going on, and the wholesale destruction of everything in Gaza, everything standing in Gaza, has reached a worse point than anything, I would say, even in the 1845 to 1849 famine and Holocaust, as it was called, the Irish Holocaust. This is really a situation where it seems that hope depends on two things. It depends on understanding that this kind of a reconstruction perspective, whose idea is over a whole region of the world to make life better than it was before the disaster, and therefore, in a certain sense, overcome the disaster and give hope to people that it can be overcome. And the other thing that it obviously depends on is making the United States government change its policy by all forms of political mobilization and pressure to bring about the change in this incredibly duplicitous policy of the Biden administration. It almost calls for a poem, I would say, about how Joe Biden can possibly constantly face in two directions at once. How he does that, it's horrible. It pains him. He's totally supporting it. There was apparently another lurch on this in the last 48 hours since the killing of the 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers. Absolutely, the purpose of our conference on April 13th, of the conference of the Schiller Institute on the subject of the Oasis plan, which is, of course, has different objectives economically than the Shannon scheme did. Ireland's got plenty of water. It's never going to have a drought, not in anyone's lifetime that's alive now. And here we have a situation in which the predominant feature is desert and the need for new fresh water. as well as much more power. So it's different in that sense, but the spirit of going into it, um, again, a parliament which didn't represent a nation at all when it began to plan this project. It had no more representation than, say, the Palestinian Authority does now
Mhm.
for the West Bank and Gaza. And yet it was planning for the more or less instant launching of a project like this. And then along came this very gifted engineer, Dr. Thomas McLaughlin, uh, with a plan, which was quite unique, difficult to come up with, quite unique among hydroelectric projects in the whole world at the time. And I think the Oasis plan, when it becomes linked to the Belt and Road Initiative and to the land bridges through the area, will also be unique. It will probably be the most, well, I won't go into speculations like that, but it will have a uniqueness, and it will promise that at the end of this terrible warfare and killing, that life will actually become better at some point as a result. So
Thanks. I concur. We have to make it happen. It's very tough, and your emphasis also on the United States. I think one reason it may be hard for Americans in particular to conceptualize how this would work is that it's been so very long in our own country since we had any kind of shared mission, maybe the most recent time being the space program, where people really pulled together. I happen to just recently have re-watched the film Hidden Figures about Katherine Johnson and the
mhm.
team of African American women in NASA. There were quite a few of them doing all different functions. And what you saw is because the nation had a mission, in this case, we were racing to get to the moon, uh, people were valued for their talents, and their complexion was secondary. And in some cases, NASA engineers intervened to allow one of the women to become the first African American and first woman to ever be admitted to a particular engineering school. Um, so that was, let's see, that was the 1960s. Kennedy's assassinated in 63. We get to the moon in 69. The last moon landing is 72. So now you're talking 52 years ago. Um, there's a few things that have been built, like the Lake Pontchartrain, that big water uh, storm surge barrier around New Orleans, but there's been very little, and I can imagine these things would really unify people very quickly, but it's a challenge to find a reference point when the population is so embedded in pessimism. And I thought what you said about the Irish population being very pessimistic is of interest.
I said it, and so did the announcer in the film. Yes, it obviously. I mean, there probably was not a more pessimistic population in the general sense in the world as of 1918, 1919 than the Irish population. And just how do we get out of here, right? How do we get out of here and get to America? Um, so it's I think what you raised about the Transcontinental Railroad in our history is also really indicative, because it was being sniped at to attempt to actually be building this while fighting for the Union, was sniped at a great deal by so-called financiers who had been kind of left out. Uh, Not, they didn't call themselves Wall Street at that time, but the New York financiers who had been somewhat left out in the Lincoln administration credit policy, the greenback and the bank currency policies. Um, they'd been left out, and this was an extraordinary thing to attempt to do. It went far beyond simply having railroads running to the battlefields, which everyone recognized was an advantage for the Union forces, and that was obvious. But this went well beyond that in its planning and in the credit, obviously, which had to be extended in the form of land and in the form of new U.S. government bonds in order to get it going. But it was fundamental to the idea of what the Union was capable of doing and what the Union was committed to doing if it would if it were able to end the rebellion. So I think this thing goes through many examples.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good point to wrap up. Do you have any concluding thoughts about this?
Well, not really. I think I've said what strikes me as most important about this, um, and it really is a matter of astonishment to see that it was this which, in a way, led directly to the Tennessee Valley Authority, something that we have, and that's no exaggeration to say that. I think that I've shown that that the TVA replaced this as the leading example of such engineering in the world and became an absolute wonder of the world, which, as JFK said, was the reason that most diplomatic visitors came to the United States. They wanted to see Broadway and they wanted to see the TVA. I think that's what he said. Um, so, oh, and no, he said they wanted to see the stock exchange and they wanted to see the TVA. Um, but that relationship is direct, and so we also owe something directly to this Shannon scheme.
Thanks. So I would just like to encourage people to sign up and register for the conference that you referenced, schillerinstitute.com, on the Oasis plan, which is next Saturday, a week from tomorrow, when this is recorded. Please visit the Schiller Institute website. This will feature leaders from Southwest Asia, engineers, experts on the region. It's very important. If you're in the New York City area and you're going to help with the petitioning, there will be a meeting at an undisclosed location in Manhattan. If you sign up on the website, someone will get back to you so we can train people for the petitioning, which begins on April 16th. And for everybody who has not yet signed up to help with the petitioning, has not yet completed your legal donation of $3,300 from the beginning of the campaign through June 26th, please do that as well. And with any luck, we will be here again next week and be able to hold that conference. The world seems to be on a very short fuse, but I think a lot of people are waking up as well. So it's kind of a race against time. But thank you very much, Paul.